The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour pharmacy buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow across my exhausted face as I counted coins on the counter for the third time. $42.87 exactly. My last money until payday, still 10 agonizing days away. The pharmacist tapped his fingers impatiently as I separated the quarters from the dimes, his expression making it clear I was keeping him from more important tasks. Rain pelted against the large windows, matching the storm of worry in my mind. Rent was already late, the electric bill had a final notice, and Lily needed new shoes for school. I pushed my limp brown hair away from my face, the weight of single motherhood feeling particularly heavy tonight. The pharmacist slid my prescription across the counter with barely concealed irritation. Generic pain relievers and vitamins, the bare minimum to keep me functioning through double shifts at the diner. A harsh cough cut through the sterile silence of the nearly empty pharmacy, drawing my attention to a small boy huddled against his teenage babysitter near the cold medicine aisle. His cheeks burned with fever, eyes glassy and unfocused as another coughing fit racked his tiny body. The girl looked barely 17, panic evident in her wide eyes as she clutched her phone in one hand and a prescription in the other. I could hear her frantic whispers, even from where I stood. "I only have $15. The medicine costs $40. They said I have to pay full price. The insurance card isn't working." I tried calling his parents again, but they still aren't answering. The pharmacist called next, forcing the girl to approach with the boy trailing weakly behind her. I gathered my meager purchases, ready to leave, but something stopped me. The boy's fevered face reminded me so much of Lily last winter, when bronchitis had turned into pneumonia. That horrible feeling of helplessness as a parent. The pit of despair watching your child suffer. I knew that look well. My fingers tightened around my wallet, feeling the worn leather that contained literally everything I had to survive the next 10 days. The girl was crying now, quiet, desperate tears as she tried to negotiate with the unmoved pharmacist. The prescription was for antibiotics. Something serious then. Not just a cold. I thought about my empty refrigerator at home. The past due notices. The promise of macaroni and cheese I had made to Lily for dinner tomorrow. But then the boy coughed again, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from his very core. Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking back to the counter, wallet in hand. Something in me simply could not walk away, could not prioritize my own desperate situation over this child who needed help right now. I had been alone like this girl too many times, with no one to turn to when Lily was sick. This time, someone would be there. This time, kindness would win over caution, even if it meant nothing but ramen noodles and tap water for the next 10 days. And now please stop and subscribe to my channel. Every subscriber brings me closer to 1,000, which helps me keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. I approached the counter where the teenage girl was still pleading with the pharmacist, her hands trembling as she held out crumpled bills. The small boy leaned against her, his eyes half closed with fatigue, dark curls damp with sweat against his forehead. He looked about 7 or 8, maybe the same age as my Lily. I touched the girl's shoulder gently, and she turned to me with startled, tear-filled eyes. "My name is Elena," I said quietly. "Is there a problem with his prescription?" The girl nodded frantically, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her name was Zoe, she explained between hiccuping breaths. She was babysitting Marco while his parents were at some important business dinner out of town. He had seemed fine earlier but started burning with fever just hours ago, and now she couldn't reach them at all. Their phones kept going straight to voicemail. The pediatrician had called in an emergency prescription after a telehealth visit, but the insurance information Zoe had wasn't working. The antibiotics cost $40, and she only had 15. I glanced at the prescription on the counter. Serious bacterial infection, not something that could wait until morning. The pharmacist stood impassive, explaining again that without proper payment or insurance, his hands were tied. I looked down at my worn wallet, felt the weight of all my responsibilities pressing down on me. The empty pantry at home, the stack of bills, Lily's school supplies still unpurchased. But then Marco coughed again, that terrible deep rattle that spoke of infection taking hold, and my decision was already made. I pulled out my wallet and carefully counted out the remaining $25 Zoe needed, sliding it across the counter alongside her crumpled bills. The pharmacist blinked in surprise, looking between me and my own small bag of generic pain relievers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his professional detachment slipping for just a moment. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak as I watched him process the payment and prepare the antibiotics. Zoe stared at me in disbelief, gratitude washing over her young face. I waved away her stammered thanks. "Just make sure he takes all of it exactly as prescribed," I told her. "The full course, even when he starts feeling better." The pharmacist handed over the medicine with instructions, his eyes meeting mine with something that looked almost like respect. "Take care of that little boy," I said to Zoe as I gathered my single bottle of aspirin. She clutched the prescription bag to her chest like treasure, nodding vigorously as Marco leaned heavily against her side. I walked out of the pharmacy into the relentless rain, my wallet empty, but my heart somehow lighter. The knowledge of the empty refrigerator waiting at home and the bills piling up couldn't quite extinguish the small flame of satisfaction that warmed me from within. Some choices were simply beyond calculation, beyond the cold mathematics of survival. Sometimes being human meant choosing compassion over caution, even when you couldn't afford it. My apartment key stuck in the lock as usual, requiring that familiar jiggle and extra push before the door finally swung open with a protesting creak. The chill hit me immediately. I'd turned the thermostat down to 62 before leaving that morning, another small sacrifice in the endless battle to keep the utility bills manageable. Rain still drummed against the single window in our living room, the sound amplified by the thin walls of the apartment building. I shivered, keeping my coat on as I moved through the darkness toward the kitchen, not wanting to waste electricity by turning on lights I didn't absolutely need. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the silence, working too hard to cool almost nothing. I opened it anyway, confronted by its bare interior. Half a carton of milk, nearly expired. A single egg, some wilting lettuce. The pantry wasn't much better. One can of chicken noodle soup that would need to stretch across 2 dinners now, maybe with extra water to make it go further. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then fished yesterday's tea bag from the sink where I'd left it to dry. One more use, maybe 2 if I let it steep long enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I waited for the water to boil. 3 new emails, all with the same urgent red exclamation points in the subject lines. Final notice. Payment overdue. Disconnection warning. I closed them without reading the details I already knew too well. Then a text message appeared, from Rick, my ex. "Sorry, Elle. Child support will be late again. New job starting next week, though. Promise." The same empty words, different month. I tucked the phone away, refusing to let the familiar disappointment take root. The kettle whistled. A shrill cry in the quiet apartment. I quickly silenced it, glancing toward the single bedroom where Lily slept. Padding quietly down the short hallway, I pushed open her door just enough to peek inside. My beautiful 8-year-old daughter lay curled beneath her faded princess comforter, brown curls splayed across her pillow, one arm wrapped tightly around the stuffed rabbit she'd had since infancy. Blissfully unaware of the stack of unpaid bills, of the empty refrigerator, of how close we always were to losing everything, of how her mother had just given away their grocery money for the next 10 days to help a stranger. I leaned against the doorframe, suddenly lightheaded with exhaustion and hunger and worry. What had I done? How would we manage now? The weight of single motherhood felt crushing in that moment. The responsibility of being Lily's everything, her provider, protector, her whole world. And I was failing. I gently pulled her door closed and whispered into the darkness of our too-cold apartment, "Well, be okay." The words hung empty in the air, a promise I had no idea how to keep. But I would find a way. I always did. One more impossible month, one more miracle needed. As I sipped my bitter, twice-used tea, I wondered if I'd lost my mind at that pharmacy counter. Compassion was a luxury I simply couldn't afford. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through the thin curtains as my alarm blared at 5:30. I nudged Lily awake, moving through our morning routine on autopilot. Cereal with the last of the milk for her breakfast. A quick splash of cold water on my face instead of a proper shower to save time. Teeth brushed. Hair pulled back. Uniforms on. Out the door by 6:45 to drop Lily at the early morning program at her school. The ancient Toyota protested when I turned the key, coughing and sputtering before reluctantly roaring to life. The check engine light blinked on as we pulled away from the apartment complex, an angry orange glow on the dashboard that I pretended not to see. Not now. Please, not now. We were halfway to the school when a terrible grinding noise erupted from under the hood, the steering wheel shuddering beneath my white-knuckled grip. Lily glanced up from her backpack where she was double-checking her homework, concern crossing her small face. I forced a smile, telling her it was nothing, just the car being silly, while silently calculating the cost of a tow truck and repairs I couldn't possibly afford. Somehow we limped to the school, the grinding subsiding to an ominous whine. I watched Lily skip into the building, her yellow raincoat bright against the gray morning, before coaxing the car back to life for the short drive to Maggie's diner. The rain continued relentlessly, soaking through my worn sneakers as I splashed across the parking lot. I tied my faded blue apron around my waist at exactly 7:15, nodding to the line cook who barely acknowledged my existence. The morning regulars were already settled at their usual tables, faces buried in newspapers or phones, coffee cups steaming beside plates of eggs and bacon. The familiar smell of grease and burnt coffee filled my nostrils as I grabbed my order pad and forced my face into its customer service smile. Table 7 needed a refill. Table 4 was ready to order. The morning crawled by in a blur of coffee pots and syrup stickiness and the constant ache in my lower back. My thoughts kept drifting to the sick boy from last night, to the empty refrigerator waiting at home, to the car that might not start when my shift ended. The tip jar at the register held only a few singles and some loose change, hardly enough to split between the 3 waitresses on shift. The lunch rush came and went, if you could call it a rush. More empty tables than full ones, bad weather keeping customers away. As I wiped down table 9 for the 3rd time, Mark, the manager, motioned me over to the register. His expression told me everything before he spoke a word. Business was slow. They were cutting back on shifts. Next week's schedule would be tight. Could I manage with 3 days instead of 5? My stomach clenched into a painful knot as I nodded and assured him I understood. What else could I say? Jobs were scarce and Maggie's diner was the only place within walking distance of Lily's school. I couldn't afford to lose it, even as it was becoming impossible to survive on what it provided. I spent the rest of my shift calculating and recalculating, trying to stretch numbers that simply would not stretch any further. The dinner rush had faded to the usual evening lull, just a few regulars nursing cups of coffee and picking at the remains of meatloaf special. I was wiping down the counter, mentally calculating how to make a single can of soup stretch for both me and Lily, when the rumble of a powerful engine cut through the patter of rain outside. A sleek black Escalade pulled up directly in front of the diner, its headlights momentarily flooding the interior with harsh white light. Even through the rain-streaked windows, I could tell this vehicle cost more than I would make in several years. The entire diner seemed to collectively hold its breath as the driver's door opened and a tall figure emerged, not bothering with an umbrella as he strode purposefully toward the entrance. The bell above the door jingled, drawing all eyes to the newcomer. A strikingly handsome man in his late 20s stood in the doorway, water droplets beading on his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His presence seemed to physically transform the atmosphere of the diner. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The clinking of silverware ceased. Even Debbie, the senior waitress who treated celebrities like anyone else, straightened her posture and patted her hair. There was something about him, a quiet intensity that commanded attention without demanding it. His eyes, dark and penetrating, scanned the diner methodically before landing on me. I felt a strange jolt, like static electricity but warmer, as his gaze locked with mine. Mark hurried from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously on his apron as he approached the stranger. I couldn't hear their conversation, but Mark gestured in my direction, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something almost like deference. The stranger nodded once, then moved toward a booth in my section, sliding gracefully into the seat with his back to the wall, giving him a clear view of the entire diner. I grabbed a menu and approached his table, hyper-aware of every eye in the place following my movement. Close up, I noticed the subtle details of wealth that surrounded him. The glint of an expensive watch beneath his cuff, the barely visible monogram on his crisp white shirt, the scent of cologne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Can I help you?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady despite the inexplicable nervousness fluttering in my stomach. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable, like he was committing every detail of my face to memory. "Coffee, black," he finally said, his voice low and smooth with the barest hint of an accent I couldn't place. "And a moment of your time when it's convenient." He didn't phrase it as a question, but as a simple statement of fact, as though my agreement was a foregone conclusion. I nodded automatically, moving toward the coffee pot with the strange sensation that my ordinary life had just tilted on its axis, though I had no idea why or how. I returned with the coffee, setting it carefully on the table before him, acutely aware of the other waitresses watching from the corner of my eye. The entire diner had developed a strange, hushed quality, like everyone was straining to overhear our interaction. He hadn't touched the menu, just continued studying me with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see straight through my professional smile. I shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice quieter than intended. He took a deliberate sip of his coffee, never breaking eye contact. "No, but you know my nephew Marco," he replied. His tone casual, yet somehow weighted with significance. The name hit me like a physical force. Marco. The sick little boy from the pharmacy last night. The child for whom I'd spent my last dollars on antibiotics. How could he possibly know about that? My confusion must have shown on my face because his lips curved into a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand you paid for his medicine last night," he continued, setting down his cup with precision. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" The question hung in the air between us, deceptively simple, yet loaded with subtext I couldn't fully grasp. I clutched my order pad tighter, trying to process this bizarre development. He was clearly wealthy, from his expensive watch to his perfectly tailored suit, making the $40 I had spent seem trivial by comparison. Yet here he was, tracking me down at my workplace to question my small act of kindness. The teenager, Zoe, must have told him about me, given him my name or description. I glanced around the diner, suddenly uncomfortable with how exposed I felt. His nephew. This powerful, intimidating man was related to the fevered child I'd helped on impulse. The realization sent a strange flutter through my stomach, part apprehension, part something else I couldn't name. He was still waiting for my answer, one eyebrow slightly raised, his patience apparently limitless. I wasn't even sure what the right answer was, what he wanted to hear. The truth seemed inadequate, too simple for this charged moment. "He was sick," I finally said, meeting his gaze directly. "He needed help. That was all there was to it." Something flickered in his expression. too quick to identify before his features settled back into that careful neutrality. He studied me for another long moment, like I was a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. Most people, he said slowly, measuring each word, would not give their last $40 to a child they don't know. I held his gaze steadily, suddenly finding strength in the simple truth of my actions. He needed help. I had money. That's all. My voice was quiet but firm, unwavering despite the intensity of his stare and the weight of attention from the other customers pretending not to listen. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup with deliberate precision. I could feel him assessing me, searching for hidden motives or angles that simply weren't there. The silence stretched between us, charged with unasked questions. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like he had reached a conclusion that surprised him. "You gave your last dollars to a child you didn't know," he finally stated, the words hanging in the air between us. Not a question, but a statement of fact. The certainty in his voice sent a chill down my spine. My professional demeanor slipped, replaced by sudden suspicion. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How could he possibly know those had been my last dollars? That my wallet now held nothing but receipts and an expired coupon for dish soap? His lips curved into something too controlled to be called a smile, though it transformed his already handsome face into something almost devastating. "I make it my business to know things," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. That smooth, quiet confidence spoke volumes about who he was, about the power he wielded so effortlessly. The kind of man who could track down a waitress based on a description from his nephew's babysitter. The kind who could discover her financial situation within hours. The kind who commanded respect just by walking into a room. I felt suddenly exposed, like he had peeled back the careful layers I maintained between my struggles and the outside world. The diner seemed to recede around us, conversations fading to white noise as I tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just about a sick child and antibiotics. This was something else entirely, something I didn't understand. He watched my reaction with those penetrating eyes, noting every micro-expression that crossed my face, my confusion, my wariness, my barely concealed fear. I clutched my order pad like a shield, though it offered no protection against whatever was unfolding. My mind raced with questions I was afraid to ask. Why would someone like him care about $40? Why track me down? What did he want from me? And more urgently, how much danger was I in from someone who could so easily uncover the most private details of my life? I broke eye contact first, mumbling something about checking on my other tables, though we both knew it was an excuse to escape his unsettling presence. I had barely taken 2 steps when he spoke again, his voice stopping me as effectively as a physical barrier. "One moment, please." I turned reluctantly to see him place a cream-colored envelope on the table, sliding it toward the edge closest to me with one finger. The gesture was casual but deliberate. "Consider it repayment plus interest," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a suggestion, but a conclusion already reached. The envelope looked thick, substantial. My cheeks flushed hot with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "I didn't help him for money," I said, my voice low but firm, my hands clenched at my sides. I was painfully aware of how desperately I needed whatever was in that envelope, how it could solve so many immediate problems. The car repairs, the past due bills, food for Lily. But accepting it felt wrong, like it would somehow taint the simple act of human kindness. The strikingly handsome man in his late 20s regarded me with something like curiosity, as if my refusal was a novel experience for him. "My family pays its debts," he stated, each word precise and final, brooking no argument. It was then I noticed that the diner had emptied while we talked. The last customers had quietly paid and left, leaving their half-full coffee cups and partially eaten pie slices behind. Even the other waitresses had vanished into the back. Only Mark remained, watching nervously from behind the counter, pretending to wipe the same spot over and over. We were effectively alone. The realization sent a wave of unease through me. Not that I feared physical harm, despite the man's obvious power and the isolation of the moment. Something in his demeanor, in the careful way he handled the coffee cup, the precise distance he maintained between us, told me he was meticulously controlled in everything he did. No, what unsettled me was the sense of being caught in the gravitational pull of someone whose world operated by entirely different rules than mine. Someone who could empty a diner with his presence alone. Someone who considered $40 spent on antibiotics a debt requiring repayment. Someone who made it his business to know things about strangers. The envelope sat between us, a bridge between his world and mine, an offer I desperately needed but was afraid to accept. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, the sound amplifying the strange bubble of silence that had formed around our table. I stood frozen in indecision, my practical need warring with instinctive caution, while he waited with the infinite patience of a man unaccustomed to having his wishes denied. My eyes remained fixed on the envelope, the weight of my empty wallet in my pocket feeling suddenly heavier. Before I could respond, the handsome man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that was almost confessional. "Marco's parents, my brother and sister-in-law, were in a car accident last night," he said, the controlled facade slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of genuine worry beneath. "They hit a guardrail during the storm. They're in the hospital now. Marco was with Zoe when he developed the fever." The revelation shifted something in the atmosphere between us, transforming our strange encounter into something more human, more relatable. The careful distance I had been maintaining crumbled under a wave of genuine concern. "Is he okay now? The medicine, did it help?" I asked, forgetting momentarily about the envelope, about the diner, about everything except the sick little boy with the fevered eyes I'd encountered at the pharmacy. For the first time, the man's expression softened visibly, the sharp angles of his face relaxing into something more approachable, almost gentle. "Yes, thanks to you," he said. And there was real gratitude beneath the words, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his otherwise commanding presence. "The antibiotics brought his fever down by this morning. The doctor says you got it just in time. Bacterial pneumonia can progress quickly in children." The relief that washed through me was surprising in its intensity. I hadn't realized how worried I had been about Marco until that moment. My hands unclenched at my sides as something shifted in the air between us, the tension dissolving into something more complicated. I found myself sinking into the chair opposite him, my legs suddenly unsteady. "My brother is still unconscious," he continued, rolling his coffee cup between his palms, a small gesture that seemed strangely human from someone who otherwise appeared so perfectly controlled. "My sister-in-law has a broken arm and concussion. Marco doesn't know how serious it is. He's asking for his parents." I could see it now, the strain around his eyes, the slight dishevelment of his otherwise perfect appearance. A man who had likely been awake all night dealing with family emergencies, who had gone from hospital to tracking down a waitress who had helped his nephew. The gesture with the envelope suddenly made more sense. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about control in a situation where he otherwise had none, about restoring balance in a world that had temporarily tilted off its axis. Marco's voice had been so small this morning. When he asked why his parents hadn't come home, he said. And there was real pain there, carefully contained, but unmistakable. I didn't know what to tell him. The conversation with the strikingly handsome man in the diner haunted me as I pulled out of the parking lot, his envelope tucked reluctantly into my pocket after his quiet insistence had worn down my resistance. I was halfway home when the grinding noise from my car transformed into an alarming mechanical shriek, followed by complete silence. The Toyota shuddered once, then died completely, refusing to restart no matter how many times I turned the key. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, a hysterical laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me. Of course, of course this would happen today. I grabbed my purse and the small paper bag containing Lily's dinner leftovers, then began the mile-long trek home through the relentless rain. By the time I reached our apartment building, I was soaked through, my uniform clinging uncomfortably to my skin, the envelope still untouched in my pocket despite the temptation to check its contents. I trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, mentally rehearsing what I would tell Lily about dinner, about the car, about everything. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I almost missed it at first. My door was slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling into the hallway. Panic surged through me, hot and immediate. I had definitely locked it this morning. I always did. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Break-in, home invasion, Lily. I shoved the door open with far more force than necessary, my daughter's name already forming on my lips, only to freeze at the unexpected scene before me. Lily sat at our small kitchen table, happily drawing with what appeared to be brand-new colored pencils, her face alight with concentration. Across from her sat a woman I had never seen before, elegantly dressed in a simple black outfit, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. The woman rose smoothly as I entered, her posture impeccable. "Mrs. Matthews, I presume?" "I'm Rosa," she said in a lightly accented voice that managed to be both warm and formal simultaneously. "Mr. Russo sent me to help with your daughter while your car is being fixed." Her calm statement hit me like a physical blow. Mr. Russo, the strikingly handsome man from the diner, had a name now, and apparently the power to send someone to my apartment, to my child, within hours of meeting me. How had he found my address? How had he known my car would break down? How had this woman gained access to my locked apartment? And most disturbingly, how had all this happened in the brief time it had taken me to walk home? Lily looked up from her drawing, her face brightening at the sight of me. "Mommy, look what Rosa brought me. New art supplies and real spaghetti for dinner. And she says a man is coming to fix our car tomorrow. Isn't that nice?" I stood frozen in my own doorway, unable to process the scene before me until Rosa gracefully gathered her things and explained she had merely assisted with homework, prepared a proper dinner, and kept Lily company until I returned home. The woman exuded calm professionalism as she slipped past me with a promise to check in tomorrow, leaving me alone with my daughter and 1,000 questions spinning through my mind. Only after tucking an excited Lily into bed, her chatter about Rosa and her wonderful cooking, and the nice man who was fixing our car eventually giving way to peaceful slumber, did I remember the envelope still damp in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling fingers, sinking onto our worn sofa as I finally opened it. The contents made my heart stutter. Cash. Crisp $100 bills. I counted them twice, unable to believe what I was seeing. $5,000. More money than I'd seen at once in my entire life. More than enough to cover the past due bills, groceries, Lily's school supplies, everything that had been keeping me awake at night. I spread the bills across the coffee table, staring at them in the dim light of our apartment. What kind of man casually handed over $5,000 to a stranger who had spent $40 on medicine? What kind of man could send someone to care for my daughter before I even knew my car would break down? What kind of man was Dominic Russo? The name itself carried weight, though I couldn't yet understand why. I gathered the money back into the envelope, my practical need warring with fear of what accepting it might mean. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was an unfamiliar number, and I answered with trepidation. A man's voice identified himself as Jeff from Paramount Auto Repair. My Toyota had been towed to his shop an hour ago. The engine needed major work, but I shouldn't worry because everything was taken care of. All repairs, parts, and labor had been paid for in advance. The car would be ready tomorrow afternoon. I thanked him automatically, my mind spinning with the implications. Taken care of, just like that. A problem that would have financially devastated me, solved with a phone call from a stranger I'd met only hours ago. I hung up as Lily called from her bedroom, her voice small and sleepy. Mommy, is Rosa coming back tomorrow? She made real spaghetti, not from a can, and she said maybe she could teach me how to make cookies. I promised to ask as I tucked her back in, my daughter's innocent excitement about homemade food and kindness from strangers making my chest ache. She deserved so much more than I had been able to provide. Back in the living room, I stared at the envelope, at the money that could solve so many problems, at the price of accepting help from a man who clearly operated in a world completely different from my own. What have I gotten us into? I whispered to my empty living room, the weight of gratitude and fear and desperate need pressing down on me like a physical force. After Lily fell asleep, I sat at our small kitchen table with my laptop open, the envelope of cash placed carefully beside it, like an unexploded device requiring caution. I typed Dominic Russo into the search bar, my heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The results painted a picture both impressive and deliberately vague. Articles from business journals mentioned his numerous successful investments across the city, real estate holdings, construction companies, import businesses specializing in Italian goods, several upscale restaurants. Photos showed him at charity galas in impeccable tuxedos, always the most striking man in the frame, usually standing slightly apart from the crowd with that same penetrating gaze. A few pieces referenced the Russo family's complicated history in the city, dating back 3 generations, with carefully worded allusions to past controversies that somehow never specified what those controversies actually were. Nothing overtly criminal appeared in the search results, yet the careful omissions spoke volumes. I was still scrolling through images of Dominic cutting ribbons at hospital wing openings and presenting oversized checks to children's charities when a soft knock at my door made me jump. Mrs. Kowalski from next door stood in the hallway in her faded bathrobe, her weathered face creased with concern. She had seen the fancy woman visiting earlier, she explained in her thick Polish accent, and now she had spotted men in suits checking the building's entrance, looking at my broken car. I mentioned Dominic Russo's name, and the color drained from my neighbor's face. Be careful, she whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. Those Russos are not people you want to owe favors to. They own half the city, and not the legal half. She hurried back to her apartment before I could ask what she meant, though her meaning was clear enough. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it as the reality of my situation sank in. The strikingly handsome man who had tracked me down, who had sent someone to care for my daughter, who had arranged for my car to be fixed, was almost certainly involved in organized crime. The money on my table was not just charity. It was something more complicated, more dangerous. I stared at the envelope, my mind racing with what accepting it might mean. I should return it immediately, cut all ties, protect Lily from whatever world Dominic Russo inhabited. But then my eyes drifted to our empty refrigerator, its light illuminating bare shelves that matched my empty bank account. The past due notices piled by the door, the rent check due in 3 days, the medication Lily would need for her asthma next week. My fingers touched the edge of the envelope, the crisp bills inside representing both salvation and potential danger. Pride versus survival. Moral clarity versus desperate need. The choice that had seemed so simple in the pharmacy last night now felt impossible in the quiet darkness of my apartment. The restaurant was unlike anywhere I had ever been, its name alone making my stomach knot with anxiety as I approached the gleaming glass doors. After 2 days of internal debate, I'd finally called the number Dominic had left, determined to return the money and end whatever strange connection had formed between us. A smooth-voiced hostess answered, immediately transferring me to Dominic himself, who had suggested dinner that evening. Now, standing in the marble-floored entryway in my only decent outfit, a simple black dress I'd worn to job interviews, I felt every eye in the place assessing and dismissing me. The hostess looked at me skeptically when I gave Dominic's name, her perfectly manicured eyebrow arching slightly before she led me through the dimly lit space where crystal and silver gleamed on every table. I clutched my purse containing the envelope, feeling increasingly like an imposter with each step across the plush carpet. The other diners were clearly wealthy, their quiet conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of expensive wine glasses and subtle laughter. Dominic sat at a corner table partially secluded by an arrangement of exotic plants, his attention focused on something on his phone. He wore a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, the crisp white shirt beneath it, making his olive complexion appear even more striking. The strikingly handsome man in his late 20s looked up as I approached, immediately rising to his feet in a gesture of respect that seemed strangely old-fashioned and completely at odds with my expectations. The waiter, who had been hovering nearby with thinly veiled suspicion, straightened his posture instantly, his entire demeanor transforming as he pulled out my chair with newfound deference. I stood my ground, refusing to sit, and placed the envelope on the pristine white tablecloth. "I've come to return this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Dominic's eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I saw something like genuine surprise cross his features before his expression settled back into that careful neutrality. "Sit down, Elena," he said softly. "Please. There's someone who wants to meet you." His tone made it clear this wasn't quite a request, but not entirely a command either. Before I could respond, I noticed movement behind him as a small figure emerged from what must have been the restroom area. A child with dark curls and familiar eyes, though now bright and clear rather than fever-glazed. Marco stood beside Dominic, studying me with open curiosity, a shy smile playing at the corners of his mouth as recognition dawned on his small face. I froze in place as the small boy approached, his dark curls neatly combed, wearing what appeared to be a miniature version of a dress shirt and slacks. His cheeks held healthy color now, so different from the feverish flush I'd seen at the pharmacy. I found myself automatically kneeling down to his level, barely aware of my movements as I set my purse on the floor beside me. "Are you the angel who bought my medicine?" he asked, his voice clear and sweet, eyes wide with wonder as he studied my face. The innocent question caught me completely off guard, emotion rising in my throat so suddenly I could barely speak. I nodded, unable to form words as I took in the sight of him healthy and vibrant. Marco smiled then, a brilliant expression that transformed his entire face, and I realized with a start how much he resembled his uncle, the same striking features in miniature. "My Aunt Zoe told me you gave all your money so I could get better," he continued, his small hands clasped together nervously in front of him. "Thank you for making the sick go away." I smiled through the unexpected tears that had formed in my eyes, my planned speech about returning the money completely forgotten in the face of this child who had been saved by a simple act of kindness. "I was glad to help," I finally managed to say, my voice rough with emotion. "I have a little girl who gets sick sometimes too. Her name is Lily." I found myself sharing details about my daughter as Marco listened with serious attention, asking questions about her favorite colors and games with the earnest curiosity only children possess. All the while, the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s watched our interaction from where he remained standing, something shifting in his expression that I couldn't quite name. The careful mask of control seemed to soften around the edges, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the power and wealth. When Marco eventually returned to his seat, proudly showing me a drawing he'd made that afternoon, Dominic cleared his throat gently. "My brother would like to thank you himself when he's released from the hospital next week," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving my face as I rose from my kneeling position. "He's recovering well, but it will be several more days before he's able to leave medical care. The neurosurgeons are pleased with his progress." I heard the subtle emotion beneath his controlled tone, the genuine concern for his brother, the familial bonds that clearly ran deep. In that moment, Dominic Russo became more than just a powerful, intimidating figure. He was a man who cared deeply for his family, who had brought his nephew to meet the stranger who had helped him, who was navigating his own complex emotions while maintaining the strength his family needed. 1 week later, I pulled into the diner parking lot in my perfectly repaired Toyota, still getting used to the smooth purr of the engine rather than the alarming rattle I'd grown accustomed to. I frowned as I approached the building, noticing the darkened windows and a large sign hanging over the entrance, under new management, closed for renovations, reopening next month. My stomach dropped as I realized what this meant. My job was gone. The already insufficient shifts had disappeared entirely. The envelope of cash I'd finally accepted after meeting Marco still contained most of the $5,000, but it wouldn't last forever. I was contemplating my next move when Mark emerged from the side door, looking simultaneously nervous and excited as he waved me over. He thrust a cream-colored envelope into my hands, similar to the one Dominic had given me that first night. Inside was an official letter on expensive stationery, offering me the position of manager at the newly renovated establishment, with a salary that made my eyes widen and benefits that included health insurance for both me and Lily. I stared at Mark in disbelief as he explained that Russo Hospitality Group had purchased the building 3 days ago, with plans to transform it into an upscale family restaurant. "Mr. Russo says you have integrity," he said, his expression a mixture of awe and wariness. "That's rare. He wants someone he can trust running the place." I drove home in a daze, the letter on the passenger seat beside me feeling like a golden ticket to a life I hadn't dared imagine possible. The refrigerator that had stood empty just days ago now contained actual fresh vegetables and fruit. Lily's asthma medication sat on the counter, prescription filled. The stack of past due notices had been paid in full, and tonight, my daughter bounced excitedly around our apartment, dressed in her favorite purple dress, counting the minutes until we left for dinner with Marco and his parents, who had been released from the hospital yesterday. The restaurant was the same upscale establishment where Id met Marco, but this time I entered with my head held higher, holding Lily's hand as the hostess led us to a private dining area in the back. Marco's father sat in a wheelchair, his head still bandaged on one side, but his smile was warm and genuine as he reached for my hand. His wife stood beside him, arm in a cast decorated with Marco's colorful drawings, her eyes filled with tears as she embraced me, whispering gratitude against my hair. The children bonded instantly, Lily and Marco disappearing into an animated conversation about favorite cartoon characters and the proper way to eat spaghetti. Throughout the emotional meal, I was acutely aware of a presence watching from a discreet distance. The strikingly handsome man in his late 20s stood near the kitchen entrance, observing the scene without intruding upon it. When our eyes finally met across the room, Dominic inclined his head once in a gesture that somehow acknowledged me as an equal, despite our vastly different worlds. I returned the nod, a silent communication passing between us that contained both gratitude and something more complex. A connection forged through an unexpected act of kindness that had somehow altered the course of both our lives. As I watched Lily laughing with Marco, as I felt the weight of financial security for the first time in years, I realized that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. And sometimes, just sometimes, the simple choice to help a sick child can open doors you never knew existed.